So good evening, welcome to the Black Studies Colloquium Faculty Scholarly Presentation, The Fight Against Racial Capitalism from Maroon Communities to the Haitian Revolution. I am Rojo Robles, Assistant Professor of Black and Latino Studies and Board Member of the Black Studies Colloquium. The Black Studies Colloquium provides a space for interdisciplinary discussion on the development of scholarship for all faculty interested in Black across Baruch College. Our event series provides a forum for faculty to engage with exciting scholars, activists, and public intellectuals whose work speak to issues critical to Black studies. We support Baruch faculty lectures and work-in-progress discussions, writing workshops, and professional development opportunities and exchanges. And tonight, we have the pleasure of having with us Associate Professor of Black and Latino Studies, Tshombe Miles. Professor Miles teaches the history of race, class, and ethnicity in Latin America, and specifically Brazil. His work is particularly interested in the Black diaspora in the Atlantic world. Professor Miles has published 2 books and several articles. Also, he has written articles for popular online outlets like The Root and the African American Intellectual Society. The structure of the event will be as follows. In a moment, Professor Miles will present his work on the Black radical tradition, using examples from Maroon communities to the Haitian Revolution. The talk will focus on the question of how these communities created spaces of economic development in the face of racial capitalism, despite the explicit intent to destroy those communities. After his presentation, I will briefly be in conversation with Professor Miles, and then we will open the Zoom room for questions and comments from the audience. Please do not hesitate to use the chat box as a site for questions, reaction. Welcome, Professor Miles.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Rojo. And I just want to thank Erica Richardson. I want to thank Shelley. I want to thank Anna for helping with the technical side here. So let's begin. I just want to give a heads up. These are some ideas that I'm working on here. It's really a work in progress. I'm very animated by this idea of racial capitalism. One of the reasons I'm so animated about it is because I feel like for once, there's a way to think about the African diaspora in a way that is connective. And shows different ways of entanglement. Because one thing, if you notice, if you look at the socioeconomic conditions of African people, we notice that disproportionately that they lack resources and tend to be poor throughout the diaspora. So someone like me who does work in Brazil can see that very clearly. In Brazil, you can see that in the United States, right? And you can see it throughout Latin America. The material and economic conditions of people of African descent typically are people of those of the lower classes. And so for me, when I stumbled upon the work of Cedric Robinson in particular, but also Oliver Cox, it was really very, very intriguing, and gives me a way to think in a more international way. Before I begin, though, I'd like to give us 2 quotes for the day. And one is the one I think that most people are familiar with. Some may even think of it as a bit of a cliche, but I think it's super important as a way of thinking. And that is, the master's tools will never dismantle the house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And that's a quote from Audre Lorde. And another quote that I would like to begin with is, and I told him, you can call it socialism if you want, you can call it left Keynesian, you can call it capitalism with a human face, you can call it Teddy Pendergrass if you want to. Teddy Pendergrass, of course, being the great soul singer who passed away some years ago. And I like those quotes because they speak about economic conditions. One speaks about the idea that, particularly when we're talking about Maroon communities and we're talking about the Black radical tradition, is new ways of thinking, of not being complacent and living in a system that has not worked and doesn't work, right? And to have an imagination, to think beyond what is and think about the possibilities of what can be. And then the second quote I like by Ed Reed is that I'm not really particularly convinced one way or the other about capitalism or Marxism as economic thoughts that will save us. I think that obviously we're going to have to continue to do the work of reimagining the world, right? And so I think that's something very important. And so one of the ideas that I think that we should start to think about is racial capitalism, right? And so what is racial capitalism? Racial capitalism is capitalism, right? At least this is what scholars like Cedric Robinson has taught us. And what he is saying is that you need race in order to justify colonialism and subjugation. And you can't talk about capitalism without talking about race and colonialism. Modern day capitalism's origin is in capitalism, slavery, and the dispossession of land. The actual term racial capitalism itself comes from South Africa, right? And so in South Africa, during the moment of apartheid, racial capitalism was the way the political and social systems were organized. It explicitly spoke to a white elite that you had in South Africa, but also in making sure that white South Africans had a welfare state, right? So they had housing subsidies, access to healthcare, things that one needs to live in their life, right? While the non-white and specifically the African population had precarity and limitations of rights. And the Africans were the working class, and they were doing the labor in those societies, right? Overwhelmingly. But yet those were the ones who did not have basic rights. And this was racialized. This was something that was done with the very specific intent of saying these people are different, right? So it was racialized to the point where you segregate and you separate and exaggerate the differences between different African tribes. The Indian population, there is still in South Africa a large subcontinent Indian population, and you make differences between them. And of course, at the top of that system were white elites, but in order to make the system function, you in the managerial positions and other positions to organize the state is where the white folks would be employed, right? But what is interesting about Cedric Robinson is he argues that race and racialism preceded capitalism in Europe's hierarchical feudal system. He challenged the Marxist idea that capitalism was a revolutionary break from feudalism. So in other words, this idea that feudalism, you had a kind of archaic old system of feudalism, and then you make this break and you have capitalism, right? Which is by and large non-racial. He says that's not true. He said, indeed, capitalism evolves from feudalism and shares many aspects of European capitalism. And he says that this system happens somewhere between the 13th and 15th century, or at least its development. And he also notes racial capitalism was racial, not because of some conspiracy theory to divide workers or justify slavery and dispossession, but because racialism had already permeated Western feudal society, right? So he's saying that difference is emphasized depending on your locality, where you live, and so on. And it's used in a way to create a hierarchical society, right? And one of the people that Robinson was extremely influenced, and I was reading this article and I found this quote very useful by a woman by the name of Lee Gordon. Oliver Cox took aim at setting a prevailing assumption that where he wrote, among the most persistent social illusions of modern times, that racial prejudice was an instinctive response to physical difference, and that individual isolated bigots were responsible for racial injustice, right? And again, this comes from not Cedric Robinson, but Oliver Cox in Caste, Class, and Race. He proposes an alternative explanation. Racial feeling, quote unquote, developed hand in hand with modern systems of social organization, and consequently, racial and economic oppression could not be disentangled. Racial antagonism is part and parcel of class struggle, he held, because it developed within the capitalist system as one of its fundamentalist traits. Racial conflict were always inherently political, inseparable from the question, who shall rule the social system, the few or the many? Cox insisted was racial injustice. Cox insisted was a problem of systems and power, right? This is important, systems and power. So if you read someone like from the 50s and 60s, Gordon Allport, they deal more from the racism from the psychological perspective, right? That people are biased towards one another, you know, that there are individuals who are racist. But he's saying this is a system based upon power, right? And so I think this is fundamental in our understanding when we talk about, you know, racism. And going back to this idea that racism evolves and doesn't start in the Americas, we see, for example, in Europe, and Robinson notes this. You know, you get people like Noel Ignatieff, who wrote When the Irish Become White, right? And that's true because in Europe, the Irish were colonized and they were racialized. They were essentialized as inferiors by their conquerors. They were excluded from professions, banned in certain years from certain professions and trades, intermarriage, et cetera, right? The Irish, we will see, will be in the first iterations of the United, or what becomes the United States, indentured servants. And at the beginning, it's not clear that Africans will indeed be the racialized group that they become, right? It takes time, that works over time, right? Anti-Semitism, the many programs that we see in Europe, Jews are forced into ghettos, all kinds of laws prohibiting them from doing certain kinds of work. And in fact, you see this even in the Americas during the colonial period. In Latin America, in Brazil, there were laws prohibiting Jews as long on the side of Blacks and others from many professions in the colonial period, right? So, and these people were racialized as well. And in fact, these ideas about European races is something that is constant. all the way up into the 20th century, you're going to see, and it's immersed in national identity. And in fact, World War I and World War II has a lot to do with European racism. And of course, the height of this is the 6 million Jews who were killed in the Holocaust. But the long history of Germans racializing other groups is constant. But this all goes to say that this is a system that evolves. Now, we're going to see with the end of World War II, a kind of new system emerge because colonialism, as it happens, changes. That isn't to say colonialism has ended. We still have colonialism, we still have slavery, we still have unfree labor, and we have precarity more than anything throughout the world. So those legacies have not been corrected, but we do see a change in the system. The outwardness is not quite the same. But saying all that, let's be clear. This system evolves into a whole new thing, right? In slavery, in African racial slavery becomes at the heart of it. And you see this humongous slave trade that is not in just the United States, it's not just in Brazil, it's not just in the Caribbean, it's all throughout the Americas, right? Even Europe itself initially engaged in African slavery. And let's be clear, slavery has existed since ancient times, right? But what makes slavery different here is how it's racialized, and to the extent that it's racialized. And this doesn't just happen. This doesn't just happen in one particular quote unquote countries. And in fact, there is an international dialogue that's going on about slavery, about race, right? And though it's going to be different in different ways in different regions, there are a lot of overlapping ideas that exist with slavery. And then also, to be clear, once slavery ends in the New World, so Brazil is the last country to officially end slavery in that iteration. Of course, after that, like I said, you continue with inequality and racialized systems. But slavery ends in that iteration by 1888, and Brazil is the last place to end it. Places like Mexico end slavery in 1829. But after that is over, you're going to have a second tier of colonialism in the Americas. Western European countries are going to essentially colonize the majority of the world. In places like China, will not be formally colonized, but it'll be divided into spheres of influence, right? So one of the few countries that is able to escape this form of colonialism is Japan. And Japan becomes their own form of colonialist as well. And they become an imperial power. So they're basically playing the same kind of game. And of course, they will be defeated in World War II. So then they're brought into this other system, right? So there's a scramble for Africa, and basically all of Africa is carved up by European powers. So this is a kind of second form of colonialism. You have the English, the British, the Dutch, the Germans, and others who engage in this colonialism. But also, going back to the Americas, there is also these forms of racial hierarchy that emerged during the colonial period, right? And I'm just going to give you two examples, just one or two pictures of the casta system in the Spanish Empire. So you have slaves at the bottom, but then you have this casta system. And this is a way to maintain uh, racial hierarchies in a system where you have multiracial people. Because in many ways, the Spanish could not, and none of the colonialists could, but the Spanish put a name on it, and their system was slightly different. So they actually named this racial hierarchy system. So they had all these different names to indicate the variety of Black blood or indigenous blood one had, right? And usually this would put them on a kind of rights they would have and the kind of rights they would not have. And at the top, of course, were those who were white that were born in the colonies. But then at the very top were those who were not born in the colonies, but those who were born in Spain or Portugal. Okay, so they were considered the height of this racial hierarchy, and it was naturalized. It was made. This is normal, right? I remember one time I showed this. I had students maybe 10 years ago. I showed this Casta chart, and the students started saying, "Oh, I would be a Lobo. Oh, I would be this or I'd be that within the system." But I had to remind them, listen, why would you want to be a part of a racial hierarchical system? I mean, this is nonsense. When they put these Casta charts together, they often couldn't tell who was who, right? Because it just shows the folly and ridiculous of trying to categorize human people according to their race. But it was real. And this is just one Casta painting. And then also they usually, within the paintings, you can see the racialization of the people, right? So you have this Black woman here. She comes across as slightly aggressive. She's beating this poor white man here. So you see the kind of racism even within the pictures there. And so this is what's really constant here is racism, right? Because racial identity changes throughout the Americas and is often different depending on the economics of those situations in those societies, right? One of a book that just came out last year, I think really gets at some of this stuff it's called White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea, is by Tyler Stovall. And he shows how in the international context, uses United States and France. And he shows how ideas of liberal democracy were not intended, for people of color, for African, indigenous, or Asian people. France is colonizing parts of Africa. So they're talking about a republic. They're talking about having democracy, but yet is this democracy, this colony is for who? I mean, this democracy is for who? It's not for those who are colonized within the French Empire or in the United States. And throughout the Americas, we see these kinds of things on and on. So getting to what I really want to talk about is how can we start to think about resisting and reorganizing ourselves, right? And this goes back to the Audre Lorde's quote. I think that we have to really think about this from a perspective of smashing, so to speak, the old system and reimagining, rethinking how those systems will work. And I think that Maroons and Maroonage is interesting because it shows how people are resisting and fighting within the context of racial capitalism. So you have Maroons systems, I mean, these alternative societies all through the Americas as well. So wherever there's slavery, there are Maroons. So, and what is the United States today? North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, they had Maroons, Florida. But then we can go to Mexico. Then we can go to the Caribbean. Then we could go to South America. And all of these places, there's almost no place in the Americas you're gonna go and not see where there's slavery, Africans resisting, right? And the other piece of it is, this is not just about Africans. This is how Africans also organizing and working with others in the community, indigenous, Europeans, right? There are sometimes Europeans in these Maroon communities, but more important, often they're trading with other whites clandestinely, right? So there is an alternative economy coming about in these societies. And some of these Maroons are actually are with us till today, right? They were never destroyed, or they last for hundreds of years. So they become their own societies, right? And so I just want to talk about this not too long. I mean, because any Maroon society, we could talk for hours. A book, each one deserves a book, right? But there's some points I want to make, right? So Mexico, for one thing, I think is interesting. Mexico is often thought about a place where there are no Africans. People don't know that the second largest amount of African slaves in the 1600s, 1500s, 1600s were going to actually to Mexico. Like I said, whether they were slaves, there was maroonage. 1570, a number of slaves escaped a sugar plantation near Veracruz in Mexico. And they started a Maroon society. And one thing you always find about these Maroon societies is that it's a war. They're basically warriors because they're constantly under attack. And so if they're able to survive, it's because they also know how to engage in guerrilla warfare. And so what you see is that they often move from place to place. They're not in one place. They have to learn how to move from place to place because they're constantly being under attack. But what's interesting about Yanga, it becomes incorporated into Spain because many of these Maroons are so dangerous that the Spanish feel it's not to their advantage to fight. So what they do is they say, okay, listen, we'll give you X amount of land, but you have to basically come into the fold, right? And there are various ways to think about this. And this is something I think that's important because once they make these treaties, then they are basically essentially put into this world economic system, right? And what I mean by that is that, for one of the things that the colonialists invariably always wants is for if slaves come to your Maroon, you have to return those slaves, okay? Because what the Maroon societies have the potential of doing is actually undermining the entire society, the entire colonial society, that is. And Yanga, they sign a treaty and it becomes incorporated and it becomes a Spanish town. One of the more interesting Maroon societies is Jamaica. In Jamaica, they have Maroons going all the way back to the Spanish. Because remember, most of the Caribbean islands were first colonized by Spain. The English don't formally colonize Jamaica until 1655, right? But by 1655, the English, Maroons partner with the English and are allowed a large scale of Maroons societies emerge. And there are several treaties that are made, but it goes back and forth. There's wars, continued wars, but there's a crucial treaty signed in 1739 that allows Maroons to exist. But again, they have to make that compromise. So if slaves come, they have to return those slaves. And also in Jamaica, it really is going to go on and on. I have some other dates here. So 1795, there's another second war of a Maroon War. And that coincidentally coincides with the Haitian Revolution. And the English are scared to death because the Maroons in Jamaica know the territory. They're skilled warriors, and they're warriors going back to Africa. Okay, so they come here with that knowledge. They come to the Americas with knowledge of how to create war. They're warriors, and they're defeating the English. And really, one wonders if they didn't sign those treaties, if they may have just taken over the island. There's a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that it could have been another Haiti, but they felt it was more feasible and more profitable for them to sign a treaty. And by the way, these Maroons were not above working with the European colonists to their advantage, and they were going back and forth negotiating, right? So they held enormous power. It was enormous power. And the other example that I like to give is Palmares, and that's Brazil, right? And it lasts roughly from 1605 to 1994, and the Portuguese send in this huge military expedition, and they overthrow them. But it essentially starts as 10 separate communities, and they come together. They come together and they form a huge, larger community, which becomes known as Palmares. And one of the things that I think is important about all of these Maroons, whether it's in North Carolina or in Brazil, is they have methods of subservient farming, right? Subsistence farming, right? So they all are skilled in growing useful crops, hunting, and being pretty much self-sufficient. And I want to come back to that because that's a very important point, is that they're self-sufficient, and they're basically, because you're going to even see this in the future with other communities, more indigenous communities, like in the Mexican Revolution in 1911, one of the main causes for land, and what these peasants want is just to be left alone. They don't necessarily want much more. They want land so they can be subsistence farmers and grow their crops, maybe have a pig or two or chickens or so on, and essentially be independent. So they are very successful with that. And another thing is they are often trading. So you have Yenga, for example, in Mexico. One of the things that they request is they say, we only want white people to enter Yenga on our farm days. That's when we have our, sorry, not our farm days, but our market days. So that will be our opportunity to trade. So we're going to bring our the people we trade with in those days, because they didn't trust the Spanish. And when they say white people, they're talking about the Spanish, right? Because most of these communities are involved with indigenous, not all the time, because indigenous and Africans don't always get along, depending on the different ethnic groups. There's tensions, but there's also a lot of solidarity with these groups, right? So they specifically are concerned about the Spanish colonialism, the Spanish colonialists who will come in and maybe take infiltrate and attempt to take over, which was a reality. They constantly did that. And they also went back on their treaties, the Spanish, the English, whoever. They didn't see these folk as equals, right? They saw them as criminals, essentially, by stealing, they were stealing their person, which was viewed as the other people's property, right? But anyway, Palmares is over 20,000 inhabitants. It's huge. So in 1690, February 6, 1694, it's put down, right? So now I want to go to the Haitian slave revolt, or what becomes the Haitian Revolution. From 1791 to 1804, there's a protracted struggle where eventually the Africans are going to call what one author has called a maroon nation, right? And I'm gonna get into that in a little bit. And I think many people know Haiti was the richest colony in the Western Hemisphere. It produced sugar and other crops. So as a result, they had close to 500,000 slaves on the colony, overwhelmingly Black, majority African. There had been a strong and large Maroonish communities that existed on the island for quite some time. The French Revolution happens in 1789, which creates an enormous opportunity for the Africans to gain control over their part of the island, right? Because again, the Spanish control Hispaniola, the French come in and they take part of the island. So the French part had a lot of Maroons and Africans fighting. This revolution goes on. It creates an enormous opportunity for them to create allies with different Europeans. And at one point with the French, during the height of the French Revolution, the Haitians and French basically work out a compromise, right? And then when the French Revolution falls in France, and the rise of Napoleon in 1799, Napoleon attempts to put Haiti back into slavery, the people back into slavery. The French, the Haitian people fight the French. They win, right? They, over a protracted struggle, they defeat Napoleon's army. Napoleon was the most strongest, important army in the world, basically, right? And the Haitians, they defeat the Napoleon. So it shows you how strong and powerful these Maroon societies were. And so in this particular case, they don't sign any treaty or anything, they just take the island, right? So once independence is won, right, Haiti becomes independent, and Haiti remains fairly powerful. I mean, the Haitian government is going to help, for example, Simon Bolivar in liberating Latin America. They're going to provide arms and such. So as a result, Western Europeans really want to have nothing formally to do with Haiti. Of course, not formally, but informally, they continue to trade with Haiti. Haiti develops many links and economic links. And in fact, there's been debates and discussions about how should we talk about this representation of Haitian recognition? Like how should Haiti be recognized during their independence? Because they were not, what I mean to say is that they were not formally recognized by the Europeans, but there was trading going on with Western Europe, and there were informal relationships with the government. But there were enormous contradictions of the modern nation state of Haiti. Because even going back to Toussaint Louverture and with Dessalines, and then with Henri Christophe, and then later Pion Boya, these are all leaders of the Haitian society during the revolution and then after the revolution. They were conflicted. Should we join this modern capitalist society? Should we be a part of the racial capitalist order? And by and large, they decided that they should be. And an example of this, Toussaint Louverture, he basically puts his population, his fellow citizens, into a form of free labor. It wasn't slavery, but he was making them work the plantations because he felt we need money. How are we going to live? How are we going to have a society if we don't export sugar? So it goes back to this question about the tools, right? And how can we create new tools? it was not clear how to organize a society. But unfortunately, there's a long history, and historically, people don't look below as to what is happening, what people are asking for. And the people had spoke with their foots. They had created self-sufficient farms. They had autonomous farms. And in fact, the Haitian society had small farms that would go to market and they would export their goods, right? So they had an economy. They had a economy that worked. Who says they needed to have an export of sugar? It was the only way that the society could be functioning. But the elites in Haiti, for the most part, did not recognize that, and did not see that. And they insisted on continuing and playing a role in this kind of racial capitalism, right? Obviously different because they themselves have fought for freedom and independence. But when it comes to organizing an economic state, of creating autonomy and creating a wealthy state, wealthy in the sense that it's going to take care of their citizens, taking care of the people, it wasn't really clear. But the rules of self-sufficient farmers actually did pretty well for themselves in the 19th century in the sense of being able to take care of basic needs. But, you know, over time, these forms of self-sufficient farming is going to collapse. I mean, you're going to have the United States that's going to actually go and invade Haiti, and they're going to change the Haitian Constitution. For one, non-foreigners could not own land in Haiti. The Americans are going to change that policy, right? The French are going to force the Haitians to pay an indemnity that is crippling. The elites put all kinds of taxes on their people. They can't do it by enforcing taxes on the rural people, but when you export things, you can tax people at the port. So that's where they're taxing them, right? And the way these people are seen in the press. So if you read the popular presses of France, United States, they're seen as backwards, as having no culture or uncivilized, not having an organized economy. The country is just in chaos, it's backwards. In reality, the rural sector had organized their own economy, right? So this is something we should think about. And I think there's a lot we can learn from these maroon societies and the Haitian Revolution, right? So I think there are prescriptions there, right? Obviously, I'm not saying that today the precarious classes, people of African descent should take up arms or anything like that. But I think there are all kinds of lessons here. I think there are lessons about the commons, for example, the fact that people are going to these lands and appropriating them and taking them, right? What could that say about our urban societies, for example? You know, and a lot has been written about that, about how to create new commons. That's a possibility, right? The people do have access, in some sense, I'm talking about in today's world, of voting. But what would it look like a real agenda on a local level, even, that could create appropriate economic resources that could be sold to the market, quote unquote, right? So the political economy is something I think that is really interesting. How these Maroons are creating a self-sufficient society that they can live in a hostile world, a world that is against them, that doesn't see them as humans even, that sees them as surplus, or sees them, in this case, as being destroyed, should be destroyed, who they want to rein in and bring back into be enslaved, to be an enslaved person, right? And again, I think that doesn't look like necessarily a capitalist, socialist world, because really, in reality, socialism or capitalism, in my estimation, has never been done in a way that has really worked for the colonized, the dispossessed, right? For indigenous, for African people in the diaspora or in Africa itself, right? It has been for elites or people, for a few minority of people, but has not as of yet worked for the masses. So that tension has never really been resolved, even going back to what I would call the Maroon nation, Haiti, right? The elites were never happy with having a Maroon nation. They were constantly figuring out how to civilize the society, quote unquote, how to modernize the society, quote unquote. So we need to understand, and what can we learn from the Haitian Revolution? What can we learn from Maroon society? And what does a modern day Maroon nation look like with all the contradictions? And how will it help us to fight racial capitalism? I think a lot of this, it always takes place on local levels. I think also we have to be a warrior mentality doesn't necessarily mean violence on a hot war, but I think it means that we're being aware that the vast majority of people are under attack, and what are the solutions for the majority of people, whether they be of African heritage, but we could apply this to indigenous groups, and we could apply this to other groups as well. And also, I think that if you look closely, these societies, when they're most successful, are when they're multiracial and are creating solidarity. So what you see is the best Maroon societies that last the longest, that are the strongest, are ones that have relationships with indigenous groups, that are working with other, for instance, in Palmares, there were many whites in the society that were working as traders as well. So that's when they were at the strongest, when these kind of alternative systems were working in a different way that didn't necessarily resemble the racial capitalist system, all right? So I'm gonna leave it at that. Thank you. I'm gonna stop the share here. Okay.
Tshombe, thank you so much for your presentation, for bringing all these ideas and these, like, we were able to travel with you through many centuries and through many efforts of Black revolution and Black liberation. I have, as I mentioned before, I'm going to start the conversation. I have a couple of questions that I want to ask you, and then we're going to open the room for the audience. Yeah, I want to start by talking, right? I want to summarize some of the ideas that you presented and ask you a question after that. You presented the idea of race and the idea of racialization as a way to justify colonialism and subjugation. But definitely you presented it as a system that is based in power, in establishing power, and establishing a hierarchical society, right? That it is based on racial and economic oppression. Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, because you presented different angles of that process of racialization, if you can talk about whiteness, as an elastic concept. And I'm thinking about the example you bring from the Irish, the use, but also like the casta system, that it's so like arbitrary in so many ways. Yeah, so can you talk about that idea of whiteness as an elastic concept?
Right. I mean, again, you know, it's almost a cliche when people say race is a social construct, But I mean, when you look at it from this hemispheric position, you see how it is a construction, because it works in different ways to achieve the same result, right? Which you essentially have a few people with the resources and a vast majority without those resources. At the same time, you have, on the one hand, people fighting for positions within that society to try to distinguish themselves from other groups. So that instead of building solidarity, you create a division, and people are constantly fighting one another, right? So I think in that way, that's what it's useful for. But whiteness, at least the way it has been practiced in the Americas, is always represented those with the resources. I mean, you see that wherever in the Americas. I mean, it's not just the United States. It's almost like a universal, and it's almost naturalized. But what we realize through racial capitalism is that there's a reasoning for that, because it helps. Like I said, it keeps these groups, people disaggregated, as opposed to forming solidarity, because it's something to aspire to. Because in reality, only a small percentage of people actually benefit. For example, in South Africa, what you can do, so you see, is you bring the whites in the project with you. You give them some more positioning and economic position as well, and you certainly see that in the United States as well. In Latin America, the disproportionate of people on the top were white as well. So it's always a way of, you have to have some, you can't have everybody poor. You got to create a system with their incentives. And funny enough, even in the colonial period, in the Spanish colonies, there were mainly mixed folk who were able to actually buy whiteness. They were able to petition to the crown and say, I want to be white. Because it essentially is a social position. Now, because a lot of times it's not really even about color. So it's social positioning. It's not always about color, right? So it really depends on the society or the positioning of that society.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you also, like, my second question is about like the idea of the maroon, but also interconnected to the Haitian Revolution. And I love that idea that you presented of the maroons as the world against them, the whole world against them. Yeah, it makes me think about how the Haitian Revolution was always demonized, was always like mediatized as a brutal endeavor against against whiteness, against the colonists, and the media play a big part of demonizing and distorting the achievement of the Haitian Revolution. Yeah, and if you can like talk a little bit about that, about like the effects of the media in how we perceive the Haitian Revolution. I have noticed, like, for example, many like revolutions and war for independence are celebrated, and the people are considered heroes. But in the case of the Haitian Revolution, there's always like this like tension, and how like people talked about it, and it's because it is a successful Black revolution. It's a successful war led by Black people, right?
Right. So
can you talk about that aspect of mediatization of the perception of the Haitian Revolution?
Right. I mean, the Haitian Revolution, I mean, was something that wasn't even taught until recently. I mean, I think when I was an undergraduate in college, it wasn't really studied that much. I mean, you had a few books. Now, I mean, you think of the work of like Laurent Dubois out of Duke. His students, several of his students have written books on not just the Haitian Revolution, but this question about the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution. So there's a lot of serious work coming out about that now. So for the first time, we're really starting to see, that being part of the history. But for so long, it wasn't really seen as something serious, the Haitian Revolution. It just seemed, it was presented as these people who were like, barbaric or uncivilized. And, it was celebrated in the African-American community, for example, and throughout the Black diaspora, but in the general communities, not so much, right? Because there's that tension of if they're successful at doing that, what does that mean? And how does that impact the rest of us, right? So, I mean, that's a serious challenge to whiteness itself is legitimate. So I think it's impossible to treat the Haitian Revolution as serious. And this, you've had scholars talk about that. I forget the name of the book at the moment, but you've had this idea.
Yeah, we have, for example, Michel Roth-Trouillot talking about the silencing of the Haitian Revolution. But you're presenting precisely like what you said about like when you were talking about the Maroons or defining the Maroons. Yeah, you said like that their work as warriors or as guerrilla warriors was undermining. It was a way of undermining the colonial society. So if we consider the Haitian Revolution as a successful revolution, is because it's undermining colonial societies, right? Yeah. My third question, and then I'm gonna open the floor. The Zoom room for other people to participate is precisely about the aftermath, right, and the tensions that started to happen and how to move forward after achieving the unthinkable. Using Michel Trouillot's phrase, right, the unthinkable of actually winning, and having a successful revolution. And you're presenting like how the elites, like in many ways, like took over, the how to move forward, but you also present like how there was alternatives, from the very starts, and how the Maroons were at all times were presenting alternatives to what the elites were proposing. And you highlighted like the return to the plantation society. That was an idea that Louverture tried to like present or move forward. But also I was thinking of the idea of the kingdom that Henry Christophe created, right? Briefly, right? Like, so this idea, this reproduction of plantation society, but also the reproduction of a kingdom, of a whole like system of luxury, but also of governance that came from Europe, and he was like reproducing in many ways, adapting it as well, but definitely reproducing, but I would like you to like talk more about how during the 19th century this to talk more about, expand on those alternative models that you presented from the rural population, and the so this idea of autonomy from the fields, right?
Right. So one thing though, even before I answer that question, you just made me think of is like one of the critiques of Black Panther and the idea of Wakanda is that it was a kingdom, right? And so it's still sort of reproducing those same kinds of understandings of governance. But I think, and of course, Christophe, he built like these palaces or castles and fortresses that showed a kind of traditional forms of power and wealth. And so like even the Aztecs in history are always seen as a superior indigenous because they could create that kind of show of how their city-states, in the Incas as well, as opposed to other non-sedentary indigenous groups who were more nomadic and seen as quote unquote, again, uncivilized, because they're not representing that kind of capitalism that is admired in the society. But getting to your point, I think what is fascinating is the fact that one of the important aspects of the revolution is that that many of the peasants were able to go into rural areas and continue their farms, their small farms, and creating markets to to sell their surplus. And so they were able to have a society where they had the main staples, but then they could have the surplus go out, and they were controlling that aspect. Where like I said, where the elite seem to able to get into controlling that is at the port and in the city when it goes out. So that's where they're really controlling it. But they at every turn they want to control the land. It's always a need to enclose the land, right? But so they're one of the successful things in the Haitian Revolution, and this goes way into the 19th century, was their control of the land. So they were able to, at least many were able to have their own plots of land and able to continue. So I think that's where the success is there. But then what happens now in reimagining, right? I love to hear, because what I want is for us to open up and to think, well, this doesn't have to be, right? Yeah. So we should think about a new political way to create new commons, new ways of thinking, because everything is enclosed now. Everything is commoditized. So how can we reappropriate and take back? So some socialists have talked about that from the perspective of taking back the city, right? But I'm saying, how do we do that? I think one way is imagining that is through that the Maroon societies, and I'm not the first to think like that, right? So there's a Brazilian activist. He died, I think, in 2011. Abdias do Nascimento. And Abdias do Nascimento wrote a book called Quilombismo, right? So the Maroon societies are called quilombos in Portuguese, right? So he thought about quilombismo. So he was imagining how that could work in Brazil on the national level. And I'm saying, how can we even think about it on the local level? Because for one, we see it's very difficult, even on a local level, politically, to organize power, but it's possible, right? But once you have power, then what are you going to do with it? Like, what's your plan? Like, what's going to happen? So that's what I'm thinking is like, what do we do with that? What does that mean? What can we reappropriate to create that'll be our comments? I guess what would be our comments?
We have a question, Tshombe, we have a question that is very connected to what you were just talking about. Erika asked, can you tell us more about subsistence farming and how that differs from conventional farming and title, or how that approach was distinct and useful for Maroon communities? Was it key to creating the small markets or plots, etc.?
Right. So I think and like I said, you see this all throughout Latin America. This is not even racialized, is that the peasants want access to land, right? And like I said in the talk, like even the Mexican Revolution, for example, one of the main, Zapata, who's coming from the South, one of his main things was agrarian reform, right? And that, again, small farming, meaning that I can have food that I can literally grow, fruits and vegetables, and I can eat them myself for me and my family, right?
Mm-hmm.
This had gone about for Haitians during slavery. They were doing that already. They had plots of land they had farmed on. But then also having enough surplus that they like, and this is what I'm saying, the example of Yanga, one of the things that they were negotiating for was on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or it was like 2 days out of the week, when they go to the farm, they would be able to trade, because obviously you can't just live on fruits and vegetables. You need to be able to trade it for something else. You have to have some form of exchange. So that was something else that they wanted. And obviously this is a very rudimentary way of living, because and that's why they're so ridiculed all the time, because it's not going to create enormous wealth. But it's creating, the subsistence is creating survival, right?
Yep.
And something that possibly could be built upon. One of the ways that you keep the people down is not having a universal health education system, right? Reinvesting the money at the ports into creating schools that maybe will be able to create other ways of knowing on other skill sets that could help create and improve on the economy, right?
Yeah.
I think about one of the things like about Booker T. Washington, he's criticized in many ways, and he deserves the criticism, but on the other hand, one of the things that are instrumental in a lot of those Black schools is that they're teaching people how to farm and cultivate crops and actually innovate and actually become farmers. I mean, that's obvious, particularly you think about end of slavery, early 20th century, that's very important. So I imagine if it was more organization was allowed, because it wasn't, to give people more access to education, all kinds of education, but also skills to maybe improve from their own perspectives and their own traditions, what could have happened and how we could have maybe created alternative economies.
Yeah.
Again, this is the future, so I don't know. But
Yeah.
But I think we should think that way. I think
we have another question that is interested in returning to that question of whiteness. It says, like, can you possibly expand more on the quote unquote buying whiteness topic and how it relates to racial capitalism?
Right. So again, these are ways in which you have people buy into the society, right? So even though I'm at the bottom of the society, I have all kinds of restrictions against me because of my racial category, I can, every once in a while, the king or queen, if you work hard enough, will allow me to buy whiteness, which is a stand-in to say, to have rights and privileges that other people don't. So this is a way of maintaining and controlling the society, really. It's a maintenance of that control. Also, slaves being able to buy their freedom is a way of freedom, but it's a very conservative form of freedom. Because again, in the case of Brazil, for example, you had a large population of free people of color who owned slaves. You see this in Haiti too. And also, that's another thing when I talk about solidarity, which is interesting, is that there are key moments in which free people of color are working on the same side of slaves. And that's really important because you don't really see that much. And that's crucial for the Haitian Revolution becoming a success. But then the problem with that is that once they are free, those hierarchies don't disappear. So free people of color still think that they're better than those people who are not free, or who are African, right, who speak Creole but do not speak proper French.
Mhm.
All right, so you still see those divisions, and they don't end with the Haitian Revolution.
Yeah. Tshombe, can you talk about like moving to present times? You started your talk talking about the entanglements of the Black diaspora. Can you talk about that and how these days, like activists, like cultural producers, thinkers are like creating networks of solidarity? Because that is definitely happening as well, right? And
Right,
we're
absolutely.
in a moment of some to some extent of hope, yeah, of people
Right,
from the
right.
against racism and racial capitalism as you presented. Yeah, so can you
Yeah.
talk about that, about those things that are happening these days and those entanglements?
Right. So, I mean, like I said, this, and particularly in the context of the Atlantic world, and, you know, he just retired from University of Michigan. He was a lecturer there. He had a dissertation and he wrote this book, beautiful book. And he really talked about how these ideas of revolution were going across ships and people were talking to each other. So they were already transnational. It's not as if, so these ideas, and it goes both ways. It's with the idea of what I would call white freedom, the idea that white freedom would be the idea that Tyler Stovall is pointing about in White Liberty, you know, of this, there is, you know, the sort of Andrew Jackson's idea of freedom, where these white folks in the 1830s are starting to vote en masse, getting more access to land, but, you know, they're dispossessing at the same time the indigenous people. They are pro-slavery. But for them, there is becoming more democratic for white people. So France is becoming a republic after 1870, but then is also engaging in colonial projects like it never had before. So, you know, it's not freedom for everyone. It's organized around whiteness, right? So, but I'm sorry, I'm losing the question.
We were talking about like the possibility of thinking the implication of these stories, these maroon lessons that you're talking about, the implication of these maroon lessons to today's activists or cultural producer thinkers, etc. Yeah.
Right. So then on the other side of that, this idea of so-called white freedom is what I want to say, is the idea of what freedom looks like from the perspective of the oppressed, whether they be African descent, Asian, etc. So there's these networks now. So in Brazil, Black Lives Matter in the United States, and they're protests in Brazil, they're protesting in England, right? And so these ideas are transporting themselves and juxtaposing themselves in different ways like that now because of the internet, right? So, and really what's so important is to have an idea of progress, to be able to imagine difference. So, and that's when you can confront and change things, is when you have a plan, right? Even if that plan is a kind of ideology, it's a way of thinking and so on, but at least you can present that, you can do something with it. Whereas using the same old formats don't necessarily work, right? Because what we're seeing is a small elites, like so within the African-American community, but also within indigenous or Latino folk, small elites emerging, but the masses still disproportionately in big trouble economically, you know, still being accosted by the police, and so on, right? So if these ideas can be shared with one another and they go back and forth, maybe you can come up with ideas of resistance.
Mhm.
And then there's a way of thinking about freedom, right? Because my whole point is that we have to really be able to imagine what we mean by freedom, right? I
Mhm.
mean, are we talking about Jay-Z, like or a billionaire, one black billionaire, or are we talking
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
social mobility
Mhm.
for the masses? And what is our
Mhm.
focus? So, and what would that, and how does that look like? What does that mean? I mean, I think that a lot of times we don't think about that. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I want also to ask you about like how do you see like movement like the Garifuna movement in Central America or the Zapatista movement in Mexico, if you see them as part of this maroon thinking, as part of this like maroon legacy, because these are Afro-Indigenous
right,
movements, but they're actually
absolutely,
presenting this
absolutely,
idea of the common, of political autonomy that you are presenting as well.
absolutely, absolutely. I certainly do, because I don't think that racial capitalism is just, that's not just for people of African descent, that's for the colonized, period, those who were
Mm-hmm.
colonized, right? And so it's absolutely, I mean, they're trying to think about new projects as well of how to live, to survive.
Yeah. And dealing with displacement and dealing in the area with the extreme marginalization and lack of educational opportunities and all that, but they're presenting options. Yeah,
Right,
I feel like that's a big takeaway. Yeah, this idea of learning from the Maroons
right,
and their proposals, right? Yeah.
right, yeah.
Do we have more questions? Yeah. No? Okay, so maybe we can leave the discussion here, like thinking about the possibilities of liberation, thinking about what freedom looks like, thinking about also like the lessons that we can learn from from the Maroons and from Maroonage, yeah, the commons, political autonomy, yeah, the aspiration of multiracial solidarity and alliances. So I want to thank Professor Miles. I want to thank the Black Studies Colloquium, the Black and Latino Studies Department at Baruch College, and you all for joining us tonight. Yeah, Professor Miles, you want to say goodbye to us today?
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody that came out, and I really appreciate it. And you know, I always look forward to these kinds of discussions because it helps me. So, so it's a beautiful thing. Thank you a lot.
Thank you and good night, everybody.
Take care.